families place on helping people get off the farm. But the thing we've seen in recent years is a pattern of return migration from northern cities back to the south, and so many of those peoples are re-engaging with their family land. At the same time, to talk about forestry just a bit, so there's historically been a disconnect between African Americans and forestry in the South, something that is being addressed by some of the 1890 land grant universities, but still remains. So I'm going to really talk about some experiences that came out of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, which was a joint effort actually led by the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, along with the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which had pilot projects in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama, and then later added more products in Georgia, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Virginia, and I've been able to conduct some research in conjunction with that program over the years. I mean, the key things about this program is it tries to address both ownership issues and engagement in forestry at the same time, focus on education, providing legal assistance, and providing helping people link up with forestry and conservation providers. So we did some baseline research at the beginning of the program, and we found the historical roots tended to be in small-scale farming. There had been what I've already talked about, the emphasis on professional education, migration to urban areas, but many family members have returned to the land. Some of that land is in heirs property, meaning that it's held in common by a number of different family members who can be scattered all over the country if it goes down through several generations. We also found that land was often underutilized and that only about 20% of the landowners were making a profit from their land. The forests tended to be regenerating from old fields through natural regeneration. There hadn't been a lot of involvement in forestry activities or practices, and as a result, there were relatively low returns from the land through timber harvest. Yet we did find that land was particularly important. Historically, it was a struggle for African American families to obtain land, and that land was very important to them as sort of a homeland and a refuge. And for many of those people, their sort of family history is still inscribed on that land through old cemeteries and old home places and things like that. So this land remains very important to people, but because it's not producing a profit, it can be a burden in terms of paying taxes and trying to deal with the management and not necessarily an asset. Some of the ways that heirs property creates challenges is that, since land is owned jointly by a number of different people, they have to figure out how to pay the taxes, how to use the land, and some families have conflicts, some families come to an agreement, many are somewhere in between. Heirs property can make it difficult to rent farmland. People tended to rent it to family and friends and got relatively low returns. People are less likely to invest in heirs property because you're putting your own money into land that's held by a bunch of people in common, and it's also very difficult and often not legal to sell timber off that land. And the resolution itself is complicated because it's often held in common by family members scattered around the country that have to agree on a path forward and then get some legal assistance to take the necessary steps, which I think Mavis will talk about. So how does this link to forestry? So one of the things, because of the underinvestment, the tendency not to plant trees, or for trees to grow up naturally on abandoned farmland, those are relatively low-value timber stands. People, when they sell timber, often sell it opportunistically and are often taken advantage of by timber buyers working in the area, unscrupulous timber buyers. And then, so they don't get a lot of money, they don't invest a lot of that money back into planting trees and managing forests, and they get sort of caught in this cycle of low return and under investment. The idea is to help people break out of that cycle. And one of the things that I really want to emphasize today is, one of the things we've learned from the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program is that even if people have heirs property, they can begin the process of engaging in forestry while they're resolving the heirs property. They can get a forest management plan. They can sometimes get some financial assistance from NRCS. They can begin to learn about the value of the timber on their land, and they can begin to make plans for how the land will be productive in the future, and they can share that land with family members. And so one of the things that has been learned through that is that can help stimulate interest and guide discussions among family members and help people come together, because you're projecting an economic return rather than something that costs money to hold on to. And so this simultaneous linkage of heirs property and forestry can be very synergistic. And what I just want to emphasize, we've done some work recently trying to show the various, steps of that people have taken through this program in getting engaged in forestry. And the first 6 up here that are highlighted, people can work on their heirs property while they're doing all those kinds of things, and that can help them come to resolution. And help them become connected to their land. Once again, land is often very important for their families. So in conclusion, I just want to say that, that just because land is in heirs property doesn't mean that it's unimportant to the owners. It's a historical situation related to being disconnected from and distrustful of mainstream society and just the particular pattern that people had. But it does keep people from benefiting from their land. If you don't address it, it gets worse over time, because as it gets passed down from generation to generation, the number of people involved increases, and then it takes a lot of time and effort to resolve. But that it may help people resolve it by getting involved in forestry. And so Mavis is going to really talk some about the unique challenges and the process of resolving heirs property, but I just wanted to try to make the link between heirs property and forestry for the purpose of this webinar. And we do have several publications out and several more in process, and I'd be happy to send those to anyone. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Kelly. And Mavis.
Okay, so thank you, John. I wanted to let you know that one of our participants, Samuel, asked the question, tell us more about how heirs land can qualify for federal incentives. But I think that might also be something that Sam is going to cover later. But John, do you want to comment on that?
Sure, I can give a short answer. One of the things is that we've seen, and one of the things I didn't really talk about, but as a part of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, NRCS and state forestry agents were involved in partners, and they found some ways to be able to help people. People were able to participate in the EQIP, in certain elements of EQIP, which is a conservation assistance program, generally to get the funding to get a forest management plan. Some people, even though the land was in heirs property, through tax receipts and other things, were able to demonstrate that they had managing control of their property and able to enroll in other NRCS programs. So I think by working together, sometimes it is possible to at least get started in the process of engaging with agencies that provide assistance.
So John, I'll follow up on that just with one little minor question. So in your mind, is there anything particularly different about getting land qualified either through local or state or federal programs that's specific to heirs as opposed to other forest landowners?
Well, there is. If it's in heirs property and there isn't a signed agreement among the landowners designating someone as the manager, and if there isn't a long history of one person serving as the manager, it can be very difficult to get financial assistance. It's certainly, that's rarely an obstacle to getting technical assistance. I think what I emphasize is that you can get some financial assistance and you can start down that road and before you resolve the heirs property, and that can maybe help the family come together.
Well, thank you, John. Actually, you have put together a perfect segue for me to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Mavis Gregg. She's with the law firm, Gregg Law Firm in Durham, North Carolina. And she is, in her practice, synthesizes her professional experiences as a lawyer and a mediator with her passion for helping individuals and families maintain and grow wealth. She accomplishes this by dedicating her energy to assisting her clients with estate planning, estate administration, and heirs property matters. She serves on the board of directors of Triangle Land Conservancy, North Carolina Conservation Network, and Dispute Settlement Center. She's also on the advisory boards of Sonia Haynes Stone Center at UNC. Mavis is also the founder and co-chair of the Gregg Family Fund, which provides educational and travel abroad opportunities for young people. Mavis, it's all yours. And there you go.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yep. Good morning.
Oh, great. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction, Kelly, and thank you for the great foundation that you built, John, in talking about heirs property. So I think a great summary of what I do is really dealing with death and dirt. My goal with my heirs property clients is to assist them in determining who the owners are from a legal perspective so that they can then focus on what they're going to do with the family land. Hopefully they're going to be able to take advantage of economic opportunities that are available with family land that John mentioned and that Sam is going to cover more extensively. So I deal with death and dirt. And that's important when it comes to heirs property. I'll explain more why, but a lot of what has to do with heirs property is the legal transfer of ownership by virtue of people dying. It sounds very morbid, but it's just a fact that is inherent in heirs property. So again, for those of you who just joined the webinar, heirs property is land that's owned by multiple people, each of whom have inherited their share. And I think it's important for us to all be on the same page with how land transfers. So you can see here on the left, that's a deed. A deed is a legal document that in which a person who owns land transfers ownership to another person. And you have the grantor's name, you have the grantee's name, that's the person who's receiving ownership. There's a portion in the document that shows a legal description of the land. It's signed in front of a notary, and then it's recorded at the Register of Deeds, and we have a legal record of who the owner is. But another way of transferring land is by dying. And in North Carolina, for example, when a person dies owning real estate, on their date of death, the ownership of the land transfers to the new owners, which would be their heirs. I'll delve into that a little bit more later, but I just want you to know that land doesn't start off as heirs property. So usually we have a single owner, whether it's an individual or a couple. Imagining a situation where we have a couple and they buy a piece of land, they own it as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, meaning that when the first spouse passes away, the ownership of the property transfers in 100% to the surviving spouse. So then what happens when that next spouse passes away? Usually when we're talking about heirs property, it transfers at their death to their heirs. So in this scenario, let's imagine that we have 4 heirs. We have Michael, Sammy, Aretha, and Stevie. Now you can see here that they're each getting 1/4. A lot of people believe that when when multiple heirs inherit the property, that they're getting an automatic specific piece of property. So, for example, in this case, if there was 40 acres and Michael, Sammy, Aretha, and Stevie were getting 1/4, a lot of people actually believe that that 40 acres is automatically divided up and that each of our heirs is getting 10 acres. And that couldn't be further from the truth. They're actually getting 1/4 of the whole. They all are entitled to the whole 40 acres. They all are responsible from a legal and financial perspective of the whole 40 acres. And so that lack of that specific fact is often a source of trouble for heirs property owners, which we'll talk about again later. I just want to use this slide to point out how a family can grow over the generations. So if you look at the 2 black boxes, that's our original couple. And then the next row of yellow boxes is representative of their 4 children. The next row, which is a slightly orange color, that represents spouses. And then we see the 4th row, which is grandchildren of our original owners, and then great-grandchildren are represented by that periwinkle color at the bottom. I think it's important for us to just think about how families grow. If a couple buys property and they have children and then their children have children, the number of owners of the property necessarily will increase. There's a lot of benefits to having family property. It's a source of legacy. A lot of my clients, the family property came into ownership of the family in the early 1900s during a time that was very significant for many families, and that many people were not actually legally able to own land up until the Civil War. And after the Civil War, then men were able to own land. All men were able to own land. And then much later, women were able to own land. So a lot of people, land ownership was a significant, or has been a significant source of legacy for many generations. And it's also a source of economic stability. As John mentioned, families were able to farm off the land. Timber is a big source of economic stability. And it's also a community resource. When you have working lands, you have, they can contribute to the local economy. People who are engaged with their land are often engaged with what's happening in their community at large. So there are a lot of benefits to family-owned land. And this model of passing ownership of family land from one generation to the next is practiced all over the world. So we might, when we think of the term heirs property, we might cringe a little bit, but I think it's important for us to think of it as family property and understand that that value of family-owned property being passed from generation to generation is practiced all over the world, including Bougainville, which is in the South Pacific, Tanzania and Eastern Africa, Ghana and Western Africa, and then in the United States. Many of you may use Facebook and are familiar with the founder of Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. He and his wife actually bought probably 1,000 acres of land in Hawaii, where many years before colonialization in Hawaii, there's this value and this tribal right of ownership of land passed through one's family. So it was a right, a blood right. And Mark and his wife purchased a bunch of land that actually surrounded a lot of heirs property, and they sued to quiet title, have the court confirm that they owned the land, even though that wasn't the land that they bought. It caused such a ruckus that the Zuckerbergs thankfully dropped their lawsuit, and those families were able to keep their land. So going back to our family tree. So again, if you look at the top left-hand corner where it says 1, 2, 3, and then S, I just wanted to point out those are the different generations, and then of course yellow equals our spouses. So our family tree has grown to a much larger size than the original 2 people, and I wish I could ask you all to poll. I don't know how to do the poll, but many people might be surprised at who actually owns the land. So in this scenario, we imagine that the land is transferring ownership by virtue of people dying, and that people are passing away by the natural birth order that we would imagine, that children are passing away after their parents. So the X's represent, in the boxes, represent people who have passed away. We went from 2 owners in this first slide to 16 owners. And that's because the property ownership is transferring simply by virtue of people dying, and not because the family is making a decision to create a structure of ownership that transfers in an intentional way to people who are in the family. If you'll notice that we even have a spouse who is a non-blood relative inheriting the property, which can be a problem for a lot of people. A lot of times the reason why this happens this way is because we're relying on intestate succession. So when a person passes away, as I mentioned, you have we look at who their heirs are. If they have a will, then we can look at their will to determine who their heirs are. It is, of course, important that the will is actually filed and accepted by the clerk in the county where the property is located or where the person passed away. But if we don't have a will, then we look at intestate succession laws. And I think that's important for you all to appreciate, that these set of laws actually can create a whole different ownership picture than what most families would expect. You could have people who are non-family members, who are non-blood family members owning property. And in fact, almost all of my heirs property cases have people who are non-blood family members who are owning property. Recently, I was talking to a family where we have the 3rd spouse of a non-family member spouse inheriting a share of the family property that has been in the family since the early 1900s. And it's pretty shocking to hear that, because this family literally doesn't know this person, and they co-own property with this person. And I imagine that person doesn't know that they own a share of this family's property. So intestate succession is not a good look, but only 70% of Americans, only 30% of Americans have wills. And even with people who have wills, most often people will leave their real estate to multiple people, which creates the same type of problem. So the legal structure of heirs property is pretty complicated and very limiting. The owners own the property as tenants in common. So again, that's not like joint tenants with rights to survivorship. What that means is that their share passes to their heirs. It doesn't pass to the remaining owners. They also have the ability while they're alive to transfer their share to a third party, which happens a lot. A lot of times you'll have developers or people who are interested in the family property come in and offer to purchase one share of the property, which that person, the shareholder, can transfer if they want. And then that third party will force forced to sell the property or forced division of the property, which is not good at all for the family. And then tenants in common ownership requires unanimous decision making. What that means is that if we want to finance the property, if we want to sell the property, if we want to lease, any type of legal action with the property requires unanimous decision making. So pretty complex legal structure. It also is ripe with social conflict because you have multiple owners, each of whom have a different connection to the land, each of whom have a different value or interest in the land. And then it can be a financial burden. All of the heirs property owners become owners involuntarily. They become owners because someone related to them passed away, and now they're responsible from a financial and legal perspective. So how do we make family land ownership work? The goal is to keep it in the family, but to transfer ownership into a single entity owner, such as a trust or a limited liability company. In order to do this, we have to have all the owners agree to the new ownership model. And in order to have all of the owners agree, we actually have to find out who all of the owners are. And the starting point for that is a family tree. Family trees play such a significant role in resolving the legal issues around heirs property. So when I work with families, when families contact me with their heirs property, they usually have this goal. It could be that they want to get it into a trust or LLC, or it could be one person who wants to own all of the family property. The starting point for me is for the family to have a family tree. And that family tree would trace the family growth from the original owner to the current generations. And that family tree would then be used in my work as the attorney to identify the current owners from a legal perspective. So you might be familiar with the term title search. If you were to purchase a home, for example, your closing attorney would perform a title search on the property to ensure that the person purporting to transfer the property to you actually owns it, and that there's no judgments, no other claims against the property. That's the same thing that we do with the title search for heirs property. And then once we are able to confirm who the legal owners are, then we get the owners together to decide what's going to happen in the next chapter of ownership of the family property. And again, hopefully everyone can agree that they want to keep it in the family and that they're going to put it into an ownership structure that allows them to make the decisions about who owns the property, who benefits from the property, how the property is going to be used. Which entity is the best option? It really depends. I would say generally that if the family is just going to live off the land, that having it in a trust is pretty straightforward and doesn't require a lot of work and would be suitable for that. If they're going to be using the land for economic purposes, then having the land in a limited liability company could be helpful as well. It really just depends on how they're using it and what the makeup of the family is and how much they want to be involved or not involved with managing the property. The key thing is that we want to literally transfer the ownership of the property into an entity, which sometimes people get that far, but they don't make that transfer. So I just wanted to point that out. There are alternatives to having a single entity owner. You could maintain the current situation. A lot of attorneys automatically go to partition of the land, which is where we legally divide the land up amongst the owners. And that's not a great option because the land is not as valuable from an economic standpoint when you divide it. And then if the land can't be divided, if someone petitions the court to divide the land and it can't be divided equitably amongst all of the owners, then the court will force the sale of the land in lieu of partition, which means that it goes on the auction block just like any foreclosure. And so a significant amount of economic value is lost when it's sold in lieu of partition. So I asked the question, why should forestry professionals care about heirs property? And I think the reason why you should care about it is, again, having land, working land, having owners who are engaged with land has a strong connection to environmental health and to economic health, both on a local level, regional level, statewide, and nationally. We want our lands to be active. We want people to be engaged with their land. We want to increase the production of healthy land. And it's more than land. It's more than it's trees, it's water, it's air, it's living species. Kelly mentioned that I'm on the board of 2 conservation groups. It's also significant that when there are natural disasters and economic disasters, the family's inability to prove ownership of their property compromises their ability to receive aid in rebuilding and restoring their land, and that has further residual implications for everyone else, which I won't go into today, but I think that's something important to think about, that if there's a natural disaster and the family can't prove that they own the land, then the land will probably be in worse condition from a physical standpoint. So a lot of reasons to care as a professional. So what can all of us do for family land? I think it's important to pay attention to the people who have family or heirs property issues. It's not an easy topic, as both John and I have mentioned, but it's not insurmountable. At a minimum, families can find out who owns the land. Even if they can't get a unanimous agreement about what to do with it, at a minimum, getting the title search done, paying attention to the land will bring them so many steps forward rather than just maintaining the status quo. I think it's also important for all of us to be an advocate for planning, and that starts with ourselves. We're thinking about what services we can provide our constituents, but even with ourselves, having our own estate plans, encouraging our constituents to have estate plans, encouraging them to have wills that do not leave property to multiple heirs, that provides some sort of mechanism for the land to be in a secure ownership structure after we pass away. And then another thing that professionals can do is create asset maps. And asset maps are what we see here. So at the center we have heirs property resources in your county, so insert the name of your county or wherever you're located. And we have 4 categories: legal, institutions, government, business organizations, and you may be able to download these slides and have access to this asset map. And then as professionals, we are filling in the blanks for who these institutions are who are able to work with heirs property. So from a legal perspective, you have the attorneys that work with estates and estate planning and real estate, so people who actually specialize in those areas. They may not say that they specialize in heirs property, but that they do real estate, estate planning, estate administration. And people who present on this topic to be able to come to your community to talk about this topic. And then you can see in the other categories, institutions, government organizations, business organizations. I want to point out land conservation groups, land trusts, surveyors, appraisers. If you can build a list for your constituents, then when they come to you with this issue about heirs property, it's something that you can present to them, so they're not having to start from ground zero and finding out who these different resources are. And another thing is, it's great, John mentioned this, getting an understanding of what the family's land actually is. What are the characteristics? A lot of families just don't know that, and you can encourage them to find that out. I love speaking about the topic. I'm happy to come to your community to speak. So here's my email address. Email is the best way to reach me. And I understand that there may be some questions, Kelly, for me.
Yes, there are, as a matter of fact, a few of them. And John, I want you to stand by because I think at least one of these questions might pertain to both of you. So I'm just going to go back to time stop 1131, where Samuel said, is there a resource list for heirs property owners and leaders to find attorney representation in various states? So is there a one-stop shopping website or some place that a person could go to source out others like yourself, Mavis, that are in different states?
I'm not aware of a resource list. I have an heirs property buddy here in North Carolina who I meet regularly with, and I have some other folks who do this type of work, and that's on our dream list. We are, of course, busy attorneys, and we have to kill what we eat or eat what we kill, and so we haven't had the resources to devote to developing that list, but it definitely is a goal of ours to have that list to be able to provide to other professionals. Thanks for asking that question. If anyone wants to support our developing that list with grant funding,
sounds to me like a really good project for an NC State University graduate student. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
So also want to bring to your attention, Mavis, at time stop 11:32, do you recommend conservation easements, or are there too many stipulations for the property for that to work?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, and I think as with other questions, it really depends. But I think that as a starting point, because people are so disincentivized to do something with the family land, they often see it as a burden. I think a great starting point is to get an understanding of what the land value is, not just from a tax perspective or a market perspective, but does the land have characteristics that would make it suitable for conservation or for some other type of easement that could bring money into the pot to address the actual title issues with the land. So that's actually a starting point for me when I'm doing the initial intake. I will ask them for the information that identifies the land, and then I'll go on to the tax records and the GIS and see what some of the characteristics are of the land. If it's near water, my eyes get really excited because I know that conservation groups are often trying to protect clean water. And if it seems suitable, then I will, in the early stages, reach out to a conservation group in the area of where the land is and ask them if this is land that they would actually be interested in conserving, because it could be an option. So, you know, it really depends on the land whether or not it's too restrictive. But a lot of conservation groups have easements on land to restrict the current use, or to restrict development from the current use. That doesn't make sense, but basically that the families or the landowners are able to use it in the same current use. They just aren't going to subdivide it and plop a Walmart on it, or they're not going to change the nature of the property.
So Mavis,
that was a long answer. Hopefully that was clear.
Real quickly, when you talk about trusts, were you referring to irrevocable or revocable trusts?
I'm just talking about trusts generally. Irrevocable trusts often don't serve people well. I mean, that's just generally whether we're talking about heirs property or not. In most cases, the only reason to do an irrevocable trust is because the person is qualifying for some type of government benefit like long-term care assistance. It's required that they have an irrevocable trust. But with respect to family land, I don't see a need to have an irrevocable trust. And the reality is, generations down the road, the needs of the family or the use of the land could have changed so much that you wouldn't want to prohibit them from making adjustments to the trust to suit the current use or needs of the beneficiaries.
Okay, and then one last question came in, and I don't know if you can answer it quickly, Mavis, but could you talk about the value or limits to using mediators to help the parties? And by that, I think the questioner means helping families reach that single deciding party.
Absolutely, Ken. I have a master dispute resolution. I've been mediating for 20-some years, since I was 15. I absolutely believe mediation can play a significant role. I definitely think that well-trained mediators are better at facilitating a conversation with multi-family members than an attorney would. I think that there are attorneys who happen to be good mediators, but I think by and large the focus should be on having mediators who are capable of mediating high emotion disputes between family members to help them with making a decision about the family land. It is important that all of the legal owners are confirmed before the family goes into mediation. But I absolutely support mediation as a way of helping the parties get along. A lot of times the families get stuck at the point where they are making the decision, and we haven't been employing mediation as a way to get them further along to making a decision and taking that positive action with the land. I do trainings in conflict resolution for heirs property owners, and then also mediation training for heirs property disputes. So if you want to talk about that more, please reach out to me, Kim, or anyone else.
Thank you, Mavis. We're going to move on to our final speaker. And that final speaker is Sam Cooke, who's the Executive Director of Forest Assets with NC State University's College of Natural Resources, and he's Vice President for Natural Resources Foundation Board associated with the college. He's the former Director of Forestry for the Center for Heirs Property Preservation in the Low Country of South Carolina, near Charleston. Prior to this work, he served in several managerial positions with International Paper Company, and he's worked for Duke Energy in Durham, and he started his forestry career with USDA Forest Service Intermountain Forest and Range Experimental Station in Boise, Idaho. He is also a wise sage, I would call him, and greatly benefits the Society of American Foresters and many of the students here in the university, especially those who are working through the various different challenges that come with diversity of being in natural resources. I'd like to now turn it over to Sam Cooke.
Well, thank you, Kelly, for that introduction, and Mavis for giving us that real in-depth education on the heirs property issues, and John for your insight on the research that was done around the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, but all the history that you bring to the table with the work that you've done throughout your career. We're going to spend some time pretty much giving everyone on the phone sort of a toolkit that was developed from the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program that was created back in 2012. But the initial starting point for it was 3 pilot studies that took off in 2013. The ultimate goal of that program basically was to focus on land retention and asset creation. And we use forestry and land utilization as the carrot. One of the main things we had to look at was the broken forestry value chain for the African Americans. And the 5 bullets that we will focus throughout the whole time period that will be important to you as you look at your specific state, your county, or your community if you plan to take on this work, is the discrimination and exploitation that has happened throughout the African American community, minorities in general, heirs property, which you just heard from Mavis, the history and the results, along with the problems that go along with it. Heirs property is not an easy fix, but it is something that can be accomplished as long as the individuals are talking to each other, but focusing on the history as it moves forward and getting people to work together. Mediation, as she stated, is very critical. Broken trust. Trust is a problem amongst the family members, along with the individuals. People don't like the government. They don't trust each other. So we had to focus on how do we get trust back into the organizations, trust back amongst the people, especially families, to get them talking to each other. Access to knowledge and resources. As you know, access to USDA programs, to the Forestry Commission, and other entities have always been available to everyone, but having our people, being African Americans, focus on how do they gain that access and getting them involved with those particular entities. Markets. Our African Americans sold timber, but they were not getting the best value, so our intent through this project was to demonstrate to them if they use resource professionals to help them take their timber to market, and to ensure that they focus on reforestation. It would benefit them now and for the future of their families. We had three things that we identified as the theory of change, which was stemming African American landowners' land loss by increasing forest profitability and asset value, helping landowners to see the importance of they have a forest in their backyard. How do we get them to see it as money and an asset for the family for the future? Once they completed that, then we focus on how do we introduce them to the forestry programs that are available to them through USDA, as far as printing the outreach and complementing them with ways that they can improve their forest land versus just letting it grow back naturally. The networks of support. You heard Mavis say something about asset mapping. I will show you later on what we mean by that. But this program, that was the most important piece of the puzzle, is putting these actual resource professionals in all different spectrums together to support the landowner outcomes. Without them, the program would not have been successful. We had about 4 buckets when you look at the actual idea of the capital and the definitions for these individuals: intellectual, the social, the cultural, the natural, the built, the political, and financial. We wanted to focus on 4 of those things. One was social. How do we help build trustworthiness? You heard me mention that earlier. Land ethics, increasing awareness around the cultural. All the landowners that were identified in the project, they appreciate their land. They wanted to live on their land. They did not want to give up their land. Most importantly, they want to make sure they found a way to pass it down to the next generation. There was a fear that the next generation didn't feel the same way that they felt. So the goal there was to educate the next generation along the way. Forest and land, natural. These are the 2 key components of building asset and asset wealth. Putting a lot of time and attention we had to give to the landowners to ensure that they understood what the forest meant to them, what the land meant to them, and how they can make money and create it and pass it down. And using USDA programs as a way to help them create the asset and increase the wealth on their land, and focus heavily on the political side, i.e. the Farm Bill, and ensuring our landowners understood what it meant to go out and advocate on behalf of the Farm Bill programs. So if we look at the theory, we talk about the land and we talk about forestry. Mavis gave you a clear definition of how we focus on estate planning and clearing titles. That was a critical item in the project. Forestry, helping the landowners understand and demonstrate to them that it was a way for them to help, that they could make money, but also they can earn money by going back and replanting, doing the site prep work, but ensuring that the land was left healthy for the next group of people, family members. So when you look at the asset mapping piece, in the projects that we will talk about later on, the network was the actual system. So we had to get other nonprofit agencies in the area, all the USDA agencies together, such as NRCS, the Farm Service agencies, and Rural Development. Forest Service, including state and private, the forestry commissions across the states, the universities and the extensions, any air property organizations working on this particular issue, helping loan funds and banks understand the problem because it takes money to do work. We involve the forest industries, such as the IPs, the warehouses, the Midwest Vacos and all, the private foresters and loggers, such as the consultants and the contractors, conservation organizations. Mavis mentioned that in her presentation, but inclusive of the land trust. All these individuals are important in your network as you help to build a program to help release the issues that the landowners are dealing with as it comes to resolving their problems. So 2 things we will address, and we did address, was social justice, the affirmative address impacts of discrimination. Think about the landowners in the past. They were afraid to deal with the issue because a lot of times As they unleased the land itself, their land was stolen. So our job here was to help them understand the value of the land and ensure that the people that we brought to the table was there to help them and not destroy them or try to take their land. The asset creation. We wanted to ensure that we used the asset to build a family and the community wealth. So we were able to demonstrate to them by selling timber, focusing on land utilization, and ensuring that the landowners knew here are some things that they can do to make their life successful. Got to move this along. There was 3 pilot studies we talked about. John talked about those. Was the coastal, the Northeast, and the 2 groups in West Alabama. I did my work for the Center for Heirs in the South. We had the services. We focused on heir property and estate planning, forest management plans, consultants, helping landowners using forestry practices, getting loans to help the landowners get capital, using market access and development to ensure that the landowners were focused on timbers to good markets, and using SI certification to ensure that the landowners knew what the certification program meant. Spent a lot of time on American tree farm certification with these small landowners. Success measures dealt with heirs property, forestry plans, forestry practice and markets. We made sure each landowner followed this process as we moved them through the program. When you think about some 2-year outcomes that started in that 2014 and 2015 pilot studies, this demonstrates to you that the number of landowners that were helped in just that short time period. These numbers have tripled now in these pilot studies, which are now focusing on helping more landowners do more work in 4 other states. And John mentioned those 4 other states. Now we have the program that's in Georgia, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Virginia. Focus on those main things is retaining land ownership, building assets through forest management, and promoting sustainable forestry management and forest health. Takes a village to raise a child. If you look at the network, these are the individuals that were across the South helping to improve this process. We wanted to ensure that if you focus on this project and you do something like this in your community, this is a toolkit to help you along the way. I'll turn it back over to you, Kelly.
Okay, thank you very much, and I encourage anyone who can hang in with us for a few more minutes, but it's time for me to provide the continuing education instructions for the attendees that need to take their survey, their 5-question quiz, complete their continuing education form, and check the little box that says they participated fully. So everyone, I'm going to now push out the link that gets you to the online survey and the form. So please be patient. And for the rest of you who are not interested in this, just hang in with us for a few more minutes. Thanks. Sam, there are a couple of questions that came up, and also, John, I want to also bring you back in for just a moment. So way back up at timestamp 11:18, there was a question from Mike, and he's asking about how might I find out how many parcels in a specific state are held as heirs property. Now that sounds like a research question, but it also sounds like someone, again, looking for an organization they can check in with to find out more about this in their state. Does anybody, any of our speakers, have a comment on this?
Yeah, I can begin to address that. I mean, the short answer is we don't know. It takes a careful look at property records. There are some people that are beginning to do that. Cassandra Johnson Gaither here at the Forest Service in Athens has done that for several counties. I know that Robert Zabawa at Tuskegee University is also doing that. I would just, and that some of the providers like the Center for Heirs Property Preservation have done that too. I would just say that for those of us that work on that, we consider that information to be very sensitive because sometimes developers or other unscrupulous people will use a list of people with heirs property to go and try to take the land away from them. So most people who have that information try to hold that pretty close to their vest, but there are people beginning to develop that information and try to work with it.
Yeah, I'll just add to John's statement that if you are considering finding that information, that you employ best practices and protect that information and not make it available for third parties who are in private entities or private industry who want to use it for business purposes. Thanks for saying that, John.
Any other comments on that?
No, I think they both did a good job of providing the answer. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then there's another question here that talks about perpetuity issues with heirs properties. Frederick, I'm not exactly sure we know exactly what that means, but maybe our speakers recognize that.
Where is this question?
At 1201.
Well, in legal speak, we consider the rule against perpetuities. I'm not sure what you're getting at either, but I will say that from a legal perspective, when we are considering when we are considering who the current owners are and how far we need to research ownership back, I always go back to the last deed because the property is transferring by virtue of death from the last deed forward. So it's pretty common for me to refer back to a deed that came from the early 1900s, just so I can trace the family tree to determine who the owners are now. Because even if claims from the early 1900s wouldn't be valid, I still need to figure out who received ownership in the current scope of time that would be relevant. Hopefully that's speaking to your question about perpetuity. But I will say that rights don't just vanish or expire. Yeah. I don't know if you want to type in a clarification to that question.
At 1157, Samuel asks, will state forestry agencies complete forest management plans for heirs properties?
So I can speak to that, and I can speak to it for sure as it relates to North Carolina and Alabama and South Carolina. They do work on heir property landowners because they qualify for the acreage rule. One of the things that was done in South Carolina was to allow all landowners, being heir property or landowners that have clear title, to apply to EQIP to get forest management plans completed under the CAP plan process. And so they were able to hire technical service providers to allow of those technical service providers or the Forestry Commission agencies to go out and write those plans for the landowners. Those plans also help landowners bring family members together, i.e. for the heir property owners, to show them that here's what our land could look like, be valued at, and possibly help them look at harvesting plans to create some financial asset to them to demonstrate that if we start working on our clear title issues, that we can also do more with the land. So it was a benefit to them.
Thank you, Sam.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other questions? And Frederick, if you're still here, did you want to add anything to your question about perpetuity? Or maybe Mavis did actually answer it, but this might be your last shot here in the last minute or two to bring that up. So yeah, Frederick, I see you're typing it. No, he's good. All right. Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank all three of my presenters today. This obviously is just the beginning of an important dialogue and work that is ongoing, and I hope that you who are participating today will take advantage of the information and reach out to any of our speakers. There's a lot of great opportunity here to keep working lands working, and we all need to keep that in mind. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.